Welcome all viewers to our channel. We are glad to see you here, where we share amazing stories from people's lives. Each of you is important to us and we will be interested to know what country and city you are from. Please write about it in the comments. Now let's move on to our first story. James was only a 4-year-old boy when his life was turned upside down for the first time. It seemed to him that the world around him was a noisy but gray orphanage. Cold hallways, peeling walls, and faces he saw every day but could never remember. The caretakers tried to be kind, but always seemed too busy to pay attention to each child. James had no family or real friends. His world was limited to a cramped bedroom, a shared playroom, and dreams that one day they would come for him. He often sat at the window and watched strangers come in and then leave, holding hands with the boys and girls in his group. Why didn't they pick me? He thought. Every night he fell asleep cradling a tattered teddy bear, the last thing he had left of his mother. She had left when he was too young to understand why. All he knew was that she wasn't bringing him back. Time passed, and James believed less and less that anyone would want him. He used to think there was something wrong with him. Too loud, too unruly, too unnecessary. He'd turned 6. And he'd resigned himself to the idea that maybe it would always be that way. One spring day, when the sun was barely breaking through the heavy clouds, a married couple, George and Marion Brown, came to the orphanage. They looked as if they had stepped off the cover of a magazine. George was a tall man with a neat beard and a confident smile, dressed in an expensive suit. Marion is a slender woman with impeccable hair and a gentle voice. They stated that they wanted to give the child a new chance at life. When James first saw them, his heart beat faster. He stood in the corner of the playroom, clutching his bear, and tried not to get his hopes up, lest he be disappointed again. "And this boy?" Marion asked, pointing at James. Her voice sounded warm, but her eyes remained as cold as ice. "Oh, James," one of the teachers exclaimed happily. "He's a wonderful boy. Very clever, obedient. He's a bit withdrawn, but that's manageable." James looked up at Marion. She smiled, but her gaze was somehow evaluative, like she was picking out an item in a store. He still felt a warm wave of hope. Maybe this was his chance. Only 2 weeks later, James was officially adopted. When he first saw the Browns' new home, his eyes widened with wonder. It was a real mansion, tall windows, a wide staircase, a manicured garden. It looked like it belonged to some rich man in a movie. "Welcome home, James," George said, patting him on the shoulder. "This is your home now, too." James felt like the happiest boy in the world. He imagined playing in the garden, learning new things at the big table, watching TV with his new family. His heart was filled with a warmth he hadn't known since he lost his mother. Marion took him to his room. It was small but cozy, with a neat bed and a shelf for toys. "It's all yours," she said with a smile. James couldn't believe his eyes. This was his room, just his. He couldn't sleep for a long time that night, thinking about how his life would change. But the very next day the first oddities began to appear. When James woke up, he noticed that his bed was made perfectly, as if he hadn't slept. Marion entered the room and said coldly, "You have to make your bed every day. We don't like clutter." James nodded. He figured it was normal. All families probably did it. But the weirdness continued. At breakfast, when he tried to get himself some more cereal, George stopped him. "We don't get greedy. You eat what you're given." At that moment, James didn't pay much attention to it. He was too happy to have breakfast at the big table at all. But the more he listened to the Browns' words, the more uncomfortable he felt. Their smiles seemed strained and their warm words seemed learned. Despite this, James tried to look at the world with optimism. In the evening, he sat at the window of his room and watched the sun slowly disappear over the horizon. He thought about how tomorrow would be a new day. "Maybe I'm doing it all wrong. Maybe they will teach me how to be a good son," he thought. He wanted so much for it to be true. He wanted to be part of a family, wanted to be loved, but there was an uneasiness growing inside him. It was barely perceptible, like a subtle crackle in perfectly clear glass. The next day Marion gave him a rag and said, "Wipe the windows." We have to keep the house in order. James silently took the rag, trying to please her. In his head he repeated, "It's okay, I just have to try harder." But the anxiety didn't go away. James didn't yet know that his life in this house would be an ordeal he would never forget. James woke up early in the morning. The sun's rays were softly streaming into the room, and it was raining outside the window. He didn't realize right away that this wasn't an orphanage, that he was already home, in his new house, and that this was where he was to live. In the first few minutes his heart was filled with warmth and he even smiled a little. Yesterday had been such a good day. He and Marian and George had played board games and then sat around the table discussing how he was going to study. James thought that this would probably be his new world. But after a few hours, that feeling of coziness and security began to melt away. "James, you have to wake up." Marian stood by his bedside with an important expression on his face. "We have a lot to do. You're not going to sit in your room all day, are you?" The boy stood up, rubbing his eyes, trying to come to his senses. This was so unfamiliar. At the orphanage, he had always been ready for something, always on the move. But here, in his new home, everything was different. After breakfast, Marian gave him his first assignment without any explanation. "Go and mop the floors in the hallway. After that, clean the windows in the living room," she said. "We don't tolerate dirt. You want to live in a nice house, don't you?" James froze. He hadn't expected this. He thought he would be playing, that he would be taken to the park or for a walk. He didn't realize that chores were what would take up most of his time. Marian didn't look at him lovingly. Her gaze was cold and evaluating. She didn't expect him to be cheerful. She expected him to work. "Yes, ma'am," James managed to say, feeling his throat tighten with anxiety. The first week was a blur. The morning began with him picking up a rag and scrubbing the floors. Marian watched him, not allowing him to relax for a moment. When James, tired and sweaty, tried to ask for a break, Marian gave him a look that made him feel ashamed of his requests. "You're not done yet. We're not used to the mess. James, do you want to go back to the orphanage? Maybe someone would feel sorry for you there, but that's not going to happen here," she said coldly, and every look she gave James filled him with a sense of his own worthlessness. He was gripped by pain, not physical pain, but rather mental pain. He didn't know what to do, didn't know why he felt so guilty. He had tried. After all, George was hardly ever home, leaving in the mornings and returning late at night. He was working, and his work was more important than anything else. When he did show up, he watched silently as James completed his tasks. "We're not on vacation," George said one day when James was late cleaning up. "We have rules here. You can't just sit around doing nothing. You have to work. There has to be order in the house." James realized that his work was not appreciated. He cleaned, he washed, he cooked, and every time he did something different than the Browns expected, he heard cold, "You don't want to go back to the orphanage, do you? You remember that we could take you back if you don't obey." His heart grew even heavier at the threat. James thought there would be different rules in the house. He had hoped that he would be part of the family now, but instead he was just another laborer to be used. In the evening, after he finished his work, he sat in his room, hiding his face in his hands. Tears rolled down his cheeks, but he tried not to cry aloud. He was afraid that if he showed his weakness, they might kick him out. He didn't know how to handle this. He was alone, in this huge house, and no one cared about him. Marian walked into his room and James quickly wiped away his tears. She didn't even notice it. "You haven't tried hard enough," she said, barely glancing at his bed, which was neatly made but still not as perfect as she would have liked. "You have to do a better job if you want to stay in this house." Marian's words were eating him up inside. He felt an emptiness forming in his chest. Why were they doing this to him? Why is every step he takes, every attempt he makes to do something good, perceived as something insufficient? The first days were the cruelest school he had ever been through. He was withdrawn, didn't know what to do, how to please these people. He realized he would never be what they expected. He couldn't be the obedient, perfect child. James was not prepared for the harshness of their norms and demands. And that was just the beginning. One evening, as James, tired to the point of exhaustion, lay on his small bed and tried to sleep, the door of his room opened quietly. It was George. He walked over to the bed, looked at James with some strange expression on his face, and said, "You don't want to disappoint us, do you? You don't want us to take you back to the orphanage, do you?" James froze. He felt his heart clench hard, as if his soul had suddenly disappeared. "I don't want to," he whispered, his voice trembling. "Great," George replied, "that's good." And, as always, walked away, leaving James alone. James had always wanted a real brother, someone to play with, to share his joys and troubles with, someone who would always be there to support, cheer and laugh. He imagined how good it would be to have a real big brother, someone who would show him how to be brave, someone who would lift him up if things didn't work out. When he found out he had an older brother, Eric, he was full of hope. Eric was 3 years older than James. At first glance, he was just a normal teenager, a little arrogant, but with obvious confidence. He looked like the type of guy who was used to being respected and obeyed. Eric was handsome, with good athletic accomplishments, and his friends always gathered around him. James always marveled at how easily Eric interacted with people. It seemed like Eric could have been a mentor and friend to him. However, as soon as James encountered Eric in the house for the first time, his hopes were cruelly dashed. The first day Eric came home from school, he barely noticed James sitting in the corner of the kitchen. The boy was washing dishes, as Marian had made him do. James timidly looked up, hoping his older brother would at least say hello, but instead, Eric snorted, glaring at him with disdain. "Oh, so you're not in the orphanage anymore?" Eric said mockingly, leaning against the door jamb. "Do you still live here? Aren't you afraid they'll put you back there again?" James felt his face grow hot with shame. He knew that Eric was older, that he could use that against him, but Eric's words penetrated deeper than any rebuke James had ever heard. It wasn't just mockery, it was a sense that his life and feelings didn't matter. Eric looked at him as if he were some sort of inferior being. James was silent. He didn't know what to say, how to answer. He just kept washing the dishes without looking up. His hands began to shake, and soapy water poured into his eyes, but he couldn't stop. He couldn't let himself back down, couldn't give Eric a reason to despise him even more. Eric watched him for a while, and then, with disdain in his voice, said, "Look, I don't give a shit what you're doing here, but if you want, I can teach you how to be normal. You look like a freak with those greasy hands." James froze, feeling each of those words pierce his heart. It wasn't just humiliation, it was the first step toward realizing that Eric would be his enemy, not his friend. Over the next few days, Eric continued to taunt James, bullying him in every way possible. He began to think of clever ways to humiliate James in front of everyone. One day, when James was trying to shine Eric's shoes, Eric came over and kicked him in the stomach. "You're cleaning weird. Is this your first job? You think you're even worthy of tying my shoelaces?" James felt tears coming to his eyes, but he held back. He didn't want to show Eric his weakness. How many times had he begged himself not to cry, not to surrender his feelings? He couldn't let himself be like everyone else, so helpless, like those kids who were always crying around the corner. Eric noticed that James wasn't crying, and it only seemed to make him angrier. "You're so stupid you can't even follow instructions properly. Who taught you?" "I'm sure they probably didn't show you that at the orphanage," Eric said wryly. James was silent again, trying to ignore his words, but everything was churning inside. He didn't know how to be in this situation. He thought Eric would be a brother to him, a friend, someone important, but now he was just a source of pain and frustration for him. Despite all the humiliation, James couldn't quite let go of his dreams of brotherhood. He dared to approach Eric one day, hoping that he would soften a little. Maybe if he was a little closer, if he showed Eric that he could be good too, Eric would be more lenient with him. One day when they were at home, James mustered up the courage to walk over to Eric sitting on the couch. "Eric, maybe you want to, Maybe we could watch TV together? James asked, almost losing his voice with excitement. I know you're interested. Maybe you could show me something? Eric looked at him as if he were something very petty and unpleasant. He snorted, and then just leaned back against the back of the couch. Are you serious? You think I'm going to waste my time on some kid from the orphanage? Eric said, with a smile that was more of a sneer. Get out of here. I'm not going to waste my time on the likes of you. Those words were like a cold shower to James. He turned and walked away, feeling his heart break into pieces. He couldn't believe that this boy he thought was a brother was so cruel. After James tried to build a relationship with Eric, an invisible barrier came between them. Eric became even more violent. He stopped pretending to care about anything. He continued to despise James, but now with more confidence and cruelty. He invented new ways to humiliate him, making the boy do the dirtiest jobs and then taunting him if he did something wrong. Every day James realized more and more that his dream of a family, of a brother, was just an illusion. Eric wasn't a friend, and it looked like he never would be. And worst of all, James was too weak to change that. In these moments, when the world around him seemed cold and cruel, James tried to find solace in his solitude, in the fact that he could at least be a friend to himself. When James first stepped over the threshold of the school, he felt a slight breath of freedom. At the orphanage, he had always been told that school was a place where you could make a difference, where you could become someone. He hoped it would be different now that he had a family. He was sure that at school he would be seen as a normal boy, not someone who was shuttled from one orphanage to another year after year. Everything seemed new and uncharted on the first day. James looked around eagerly, looking at the guys sitting in the classroom. There was no contempt in their eyes like Eric's. There wasn't that hard, cold line that made him insignificant and worthless. Here he could be like everyone else, and the thought lifted his spirits. He sat in the front row, clutching a pencil in his hands. The teacher, a kind woman with bright glasses and a friendly look, smiled and explained the assignments. James understood everything she said. He had always been good at studying, always loved reading and solving problems, and now he could feel the knowledge filling him. How it gave him a sense of control, something he missed so much at home. Well done, James, the teacher said, noticing his hand raised in response to the question. You obviously know what I'm talking about. Try to participate more often. You're a clever boy. The teacher's words were like a fresh breath of air. They gave James an air of confidence. He began to feel that there was a place for him in this world. Maybe at school he could be what he'd always dreamed of, being a normal boy, with friends who would support him. But the longer James stayed at the school, the clearer he realized that his mornings started with a clean slate, but his evenings ended in shadows. James really excelled at school. He grasped new topics quickly, liked to help his classmates, and was always ready for class. He felt himself drifting away from the pressures of home, from the thought that Marion and George would be unhappy with his housework again. At school he was seen as a capable, intelligent boy, and this gave him strength. But on his way home, James was once again faced with harsh reality. The housework was never finished. Every night, instead of resting or doing homework, he scrubbed floors, did laundry, and cooked dinner. Sometimes, when his strength was running low, he thought he just couldn't take it anymore. He couldn't tell his teachers what was going on at home. He couldn't share his problems, because what would he say? That his family was using him as a domestic helper? That he was being robbed of the joy of being a child? James was afraid that if he told, he would be sent back to the orphanage, and this time his life would be even worse. Teachers began to notice that James, although he was doing well in class, began to look tired and withdrawn. At times he fell asleep in class, unable to answer questions the way he used to. At recess, he sat alone, not engaging in conversations with other children. His classmates began to whisper why James was always so lonely, why he didn't play soccer like the other boys. James, are you all right? The teacher asked one day when he looked particularly tired. You don't look your usual self. Maybe you need some rest. James forced himself to smile, but everything hurt inside. He knew that if he said a word, he would be sent back to the place he had tried to escape from several times before. He couldn't go back to the orphanage. He couldn't go back to being the kid no one expected him to be. "Yeah, I'm fine," he answered without looking up, "just a little tired." The teacher noticed his gloom, but didn't insist. At the next teachers' meeting, however, they discussed James' situation. They were concerned about his condition, but like all adults, they could not know the whole truth. Every day at school, James tried to keep afloat, avoiding unnecessary conversations, always finding something to do to distract himself from the constant feeling of anxiety. But the longer he stayed in this house, the more he felt how alien this world felt to him. He couldn't find solace even among his classmates, because they were all busy with their own affairs, and he himself didn't know how to start a conversation with them. He tried to start friendships with a few boys who seemed nice to him, but their reactions were always neutral and sometimes even cold. One of the boys, Roy, invited him to play soccer, but after James failed to show a good game, Roy dropped him and never called him again. Then James realized that despite his studies and successes, he was still lonely. He might have been an excellent student, but in the eyes of his peers he was still a strange, quiet boy with whom no one wanted to socialize. And this loneliness, this hopelessness, was harder than any housework. One day, on his way home from school, James felt he couldn't keep quiet any longer. He walked, not deciding whether to tell Marion and George the truth or to continue to hide how much he was suffering. He felt his soul bursting with pain, wanting to tell someone everything that was going on in his life, but he didn't know who to do it with. Then he decided to write a letter. It was a letter he wasn't going to show anyone. He just wrote out everything that came up. He wrote about how hard it was for him to be in a home where he wasn't valued, where he was considered just a laborer and not a child. He wrote about his fears, how no one supports him, and how he dreams of having a real family. He put the letter under his pillow, hoping that at least that way he could let the pain out of him, but even the letter was not destined to receive a reply. James knew that this school, this small island of freedom, could be his salvation, but he also realized that he would need to survive in another, cruel world, the world he called home. James couldn't get used to how often threats and manipulation were used in the Brown house. Every day felt like a test. Marion and George, on whose kindness he had once built his dreams of family happiness, grew more cruel and cold with each passing day. Their love for him was fake and their care was only a mask to hide their true faces. After school, James couldn't relax. He could never just walk into a room, close the door, and forget about everything like the other kids. There was always something in this house that needed attention: floors, laundry, cooking. But the worst started when he did something wrong, when his efforts didn't match Marion and George's expectations. That moment when everything seemed unimportant, when James saw in their eyes not parental concern but cold indifference, it was then that he felt everything around him begin to crumble. Once, when James, tired after a whole day, forgot to mop the kitchen floor, Marion did not hold back. In the evening, when he went to the table to eat dinner as usual, she said coldly, "You forgot the floors, so you're not supposed to eat dinner." James froze, unable to believe his ears. He stood looking at Marion, who was growing more threatening with every word. George stood beside him, not saying a word, only throwing a glance full of indifference. "How dare you forget your duty?" Marion went on, and her voice grew harder and harder. "You must remember that we feed you, and that is our grace. You are not to have your supper until you have done what you are supposed to do." James tried to say something, to justify himself, to explain that he was too tired, but the words stuck in his throat. He couldn't break their rules. He knew that if he said anything unnecessary, the consequences would be worse. He went silently to his room, sitting on his bed, feeling a hunger that was only intensified by fear. He didn't know what to do. He couldn't go against their will. He tried to imagine how nice it would be to just pick up a plate and eat like a normal child, but it seemed impossible. Each threat they made, each punishment grew harsher. Food deprivation was not the only instrument of punishment in the Brown home. George and Marion realized that their manipulations could be much more effective if they used isolation and deprivation of even the most basic human needs. One day, after a particularly hard day, when James had finally finished all his chores around the house, he hoped that at least now he could relax and read a book, but his attempts to relax were interrupted when Marion entered his room. "You talk to yourself too much, James," she said coldly. "You're not even capable of being quiet. I need you to realize that you're not here to relax." Marion closed the door and left, and James, not yet realizing what was going to happen next, felt an emptiness engulf him. He was alone in his room, in complete silence, without the possibility of even going outside, because his every step was being watched under a microscope. His every action was subject to their rules, and any mistake was punished. He stayed in his room that night, feeling the loneliness consuming him. The pain of punishment and isolation was not physical, but mental. He felt his small world shrinking, growing narrower and narrower. Even in his thoughts, he was alone. George was no less cruel than Marion, but his approach was more manipulative. He often used emotional blackmail tactics, making James feel guilty about everything that happened in the house. Every day George tried to convince James that he was worthless, that his life was just a privilege they were giving him. One day when James, tired from homework, missed one of his assignments, George approached him with a threatening expression on his face. "Do you know what would happen to you if you lived in an orphanage?" His voice was full of mockery and threats. "No one would be waiting for you there, and you think I can't take you back there? You're doing too well here. Remember, you should be grateful that we took you in. You have no right to relax." Those words tore at James's soul. He felt again the fear that hadn't left him since the day he'd come to this house. He was nothing more than a broken tool to be manipulated, to be controlled. He tried to fight it, but his strength was melting away with each passing day. He didn't know how long he could hold on. Every night, when everyone seemed to have gone to bed, James stayed in his room, increasingly consumed by his thoughts and pain. Sometimes he would sit on his bed, wrapping his arms around his knees, and cry. He didn't know why things had turned out this way, why he had finally ended up in this house, why he felt alone and helpless again. His tears were silent, unheeded by anyone. He was afraid that if anyone heard, they would laugh at him or, worse, punish him for his weakness. He knew that to Marion and George his feelings meant nothing. He was only a thing to be obeyed. He often woke up in the middle of the night from disturbing dreams, when images of the childhood home, empty walls, lifeless rooms and dark corners appeared before him in the darkness. He was afraid to go back there. He was afraid that one day, when he couldn't bear to tell the truth, he would be taken away again. His only salvation was the hope that it would all end one day, but inside he knew he didn't know when that day would come. In the dark corners of this huge house, among the cold walls and indifferent faces, James found something that helped him survive. Here, in his little world, he learned to find solace despite the endless tyranny and pain. When things got especially hard at home, when every corner reminded him that he was not wanted, he sought refuge in his inner world. His room was small, but for James, it was a private sanctuary. Here, alone, he learned to survive, drawing strength from the simplest things. Every night, when he was able to finish all his chores, he would crawl into the corner of his room and wrap himself in an old blanket and start dreaming. Dreaming was his salvation. He often closed his eyes and imagined a different world, a world where no one forced him to work, where he could be whatever he wanted to be. In these dreams, James was no longer just a boy, but a man who didn't have to hide his pain. He saw himself among friends who support him, among people who love him not for what he can do for them, but for who he is. "I wish this world were real," he thought sometimes, looking at the dim light that shone through the curtains, that everything would be different, that someone would come and tell me everything would be all right. Dreams were his fortress. They kept him from giving up. Despite the tyranny that reigned in the house, they kept him from forgetting that he was capable of more, that despite everything, he was still a man, not just a labor force. One of the most important parts of his world was drawing. It became his secret hobby. which he hid from everyone but himself. In his room was an old sketchbook with yellowed pages that had once been given to him by one of his orphanage teachers. He wrote and drew in it, trying to convey what he could not say in words. His drawings were full of color, although he drew with pencils and charcoal. James depicted on the pages what he wanted to see in real life. He drew huge green meadows that stretched to the horizon. These meadows were always full of people, kind and caring people that he could talk and laugh with. There were many birds in his drawings that he never saw outside, and tall trees that he couldn't reach. One day, sitting by the window and watching the trees swaying in the breeze, James drew a picture of himself standing next to a large pine tree. He was in the painting happy, with a smile on his face, and his hands were not loaded with work, but loosely slumped at his sides. This was his ideal world, a world where he was loved, a world where there was no fear, no punishment, and no loneliness. Drawing became not just a hobby, but a real way for him to deal with reality. When he was having a hard time, he would open a notebook and draw. Every stroke, every image brought him relief. It was his place, where he could be himself without fear of anyone's judgment. James often sat by the window, looking out at the world outside the house. Even on the darkest days, when he felt like all of life was bearing down on him, nature was his only solace. He often watched the birds fly over the house, the leaves of the trees swaying in the wind. It was his one place where he felt at least a little relief. Nature reminded him that there was a life outside these walls, a life that didn't involve work and punishment. He watched the clouds that slowly drifted across the sky, and it seemed to him that they could take him far, far away, to a place where he would be safe. Every evening, as the sun set and his room grew dark, he stood at the window and began to think about how he would someday leave here, how he would find his way in this vast world. He often thought of the children he saw at school. He imagined how nice it would be if he could be like them, carefree, happy, not forced to experience loneliness and pain. He wished he could talk to them, laugh with them, play outside without fear of punishment or threats. Despite all this, James never gave up. There was a strength in his heart that kept him going. Even when everything seemed to be falling apart, it was small, barely noticeable, but it was in him. Every day, when things got especially hard for him, when the punishment seemed unbearable, he remembered these little joys, his drawing, his dreams, watching the world through the window. It was his defense, his way of surviving, his way of coping with whatever life threw at him. In his world, full of pain and loneliness, these small joys became his support. He knew that in the end, despite everything, he would still retain a part of himself, a part that no one could take away. "I'll be strong," he whispered to himself sometimes as he sat in his room, drawing or looking out the window. "I will survive. I will find a way." Those words were his strength, his inner light that kept him from being swallowed up by the dark shadow that loomed over him. And even if his life remained difficult, these small joys were what kept him going and kept him going. Every night, lying in bed, James imagined how his life could be different. He dreamed of another world, of how one day he would be seen and understood. But as long as he stayed in this house, where there was no love, no care, he knew one thing: his dreams would not leave him. They would give him strength. Perhaps one day he would go out into the world and start a new life. For now, his world was contained between the pages of his notebook, outside the window, and in his dreams. Though he was alone, his dreams and his ability to see beauty even in the darkest corners of the house gave him hope. Each day in the brown house became more and more unbearable. James felt that his soul was drying up and his patience was about to reach its limit. He could no longer bear the threats, the manipulation, or the daily routine that consumed his strength. More and more often he caught himself thinking that if at least someone would come and help, he would not feel so helpless and abandoned. But there was no hope of rescue. He was alone, just him and his dreams. And then, one night, after receiving another punishment for an uncompleted assignment, his patience ran out. In that moment, among the dark corners of his room, James made a decision that would change his life. He knew his chance of escape was slim, but still he decided to try. A plan was born in his mind to run, to escape from this house, to run away into the night, without looking back, without thinking of the consequences. He was prepared to go to any price, just to be away from this place. James listened to the silence that enveloped the house. Everyone in the house was asleep: George, Marion, even Eric, though Eric was always on guard, watching him and never missing an opportunity to humiliate him. But now, at this moment, they were all absorbed in a sleep that seemed so unnatural to James, who didn't deserve it. He knew that this silence might be his only ally. Walking to the door of his room, James pulled the knob, careful not to wake anyone. The back door was the only place he could go outside without attracting attention. It creaked, but it was a creak no one could hear, too late to be heard. He opened it just a little, listening. The dark night sky drew his gaze, promising freedom, distant horizons he'd never seen. He took the first step. The moment James found himself outside the house was both terrifying and liberating. He felt his heart pounding in his chest, his body trembling, but at the same time he felt that everything he had experienced was all behind him. Now, in the dark night, outside, anything was possible. He paced the damp grass, looking ahead, not thinking about what might be waiting for him. All he wanted was to be free. He knew he couldn't go far, they would quickly notice his disappearance, but as long as he was in that shadow, as long as he was hidden in the night, anything seemed possible. He moved quickly, trying not to make any noise, skirting past the bushes that seemed to be his natural hiding place, his salvation. He couldn't look back, couldn't allow himself to think about being caught. At this moment, his world was just ahead of him. With each step, his hope for a better future grew stronger. He dreamed that someday he could find a place where he would be loved, where he could be himself, without fear of punishment, of threats, of loneliness. But something elusive told him that escape was only the beginning, not the end. When James reached the forest, his steps became more confident, but he was too sure of his path. One thing he hadn't considered: George was not a simple man. He had always been on guard, always known how to control a situation, and now his evil instinct was awakened. He sat in his office and worked late into the night, and when he heard the door creak open and James's shadow disappear, his eyes narrowed. His first impulse was not to go after him at once, but to wait, and he was right. A few minutes later, he heard his footsteps begin to fade into the silence of the night. George knew they couldn't let James escape. It wasn't just that, it was a threat to his authority. He got up from the table, put on his boots, picked up the flashlight, and ordered Marion stiffly, "Hold him down. He's not getting away from us." When James felt his footsteps growing louder and more noticeable, he sped up. But at that moment George came out from behind the trees. His figure was clearly visible, his eyes burning with rage. "What? You think you can get away from me?" George shouted, grabbing him by the shoulder and turning him around sharply. James froze with fear. He knew it was over, that he was trapped. This wasn't just an encounter with a man. This was an encounter with something bigger, more violent. Instantly George grabbed him by the scruff of his neck and pulled him back towards the house, with his whole body tensed like a wild animal. "You betrayed me, James. You could have been grateful for everything I gave you. You can't even appreciate how hard it is for me to be with you," George scolded him, dragging him through the dark parts of the garden. When James returned to the house, the most brutal showdown awaited him. Marion stood in the doorway, watching with a cold expression on her face. She was silent, but her gaze was full of judgment. "Did you think we wouldn't find you?" George said, pushing him to the side and giving him a hard stare. "Did you think you could leave whenever you wanted? You should have realized there was no turning back for you. You found your power, but it's only going to ruin you." James stood there, not knowing what to say. The only thing going through his mind was how he could let himself think he could walk away. He was too young to do it, too weak. George swung around and slapped him on the back. James barely stayed on his feet, but he didn't dare even move. Each blow was like the last straw that shattered his inner world. "You can't leave. You can't do anything. You're nothing," screamed George. And the punishment became even harsher. No more petty reproaches and threats. Now James felt the full weight of his foster parents' ruthless authority. He couldn't leave. He could no longer dream. Every morning James rose with the same thought: how to avoid attention at school, how to avoid falling into another trap. He knew that the tyrannies of home still wouldn't leave him, and that he had to hide the traces of his pain and fear behind the walls of the school. However, he also knew that every morning brought him closer to the moment when he could escape into his own little private universe, where no one would scold him for the slightest mistake. In this world, there was only studies, books, and his own dreams. But this world wasn't enough, and when everything seemed too complicated, a person appeared in his life who changed everything: Lisa. She was the new girl in the class, and immediately attracted the attention of all the students. Lisa was bright, kind, with a genuine smile that immediately energized everyone around her. The first time James noticed her, she was standing at the blackboard, answering a question from the teacher. Her voice was firm, confident, and there was some inner glowing power in it that was so different from anything else he knew. But it was that strength that was what caught his attention, not her smile, not her beauty, but her ability to be herself without hiding her emotions. To James, who hid behind his inner wall every day, this openness seemed incredible. The first day they met, Lisa approached him as they were all leaving class. "Hi, are you new to the class?" she asked with genuine interest. James immediately realized that she wasn't just being polite. She really wanted to get to know him. It was the first moment when he felt like he wasn't a stranger among his classmates. "Yeah, He hesitated a little, not knowing what to say, but Lisa continued to look at him with such anxious curiosity that James felt his heart beat faster. "I'm James." "Oh, it's nice to meet you, James. I'm Lisa." She extended her hand to him, and James, despite his shyness, shook it. It was the moment when his inner world changed a little, and he felt that this person could become something important in his life. Over the next few days, Lisa started approaching James at recess. They didn't talk for long, but every time she asked how he was doing in school, he felt that she was genuinely interested. That was unusual for him. People around him always looked at him with judgment or indifference, but Lisa was different. She was interesting to him as a person. She seemed sincere, and it frighteningly exposed his feelings, making him both pleased and afraid at the same time. One day during a break, she noticed that his arm was bruised, dark and painful, like the marks of some rough hands. Lisa leaned over immediately and asked softly, "James, what happened to your arm? You didn't hit it, did you? That looks like it hurts." James froze. He didn't know what to say. Too many times he'd had to hide the marks of his blows, to hide from prying eyes. He tried to brush it off. "It's okay. It's just, accidental. Don't worry," he said, trying to hide his embarrassment. But Lisa didn't let it go. "Are you sure about this? I can help if something's wrong. You don't have to suffer alone." Lisa said it so sincerely that James felt his chest tighten. No one had ever said those words to him. No one had ever tried to help. But he immediately felt his weakness, and the feeling was heavy. He couldn't trust his pain to anyone. He wasn't allowed to be weak, afraid to reveal himself. James hurried away from her as if this situation was something shameful. No, I'm fine," he said quickly. "Just a bit of a banged up. It's okay." Lisa stayed with him anyway, not backing down. "If you ever want to talk or ask for help, I'm always here for you," she said softly and stepped back, but her words stayed with him. The next day, Lisa approached James again. He felt contradictory feelings. On the one hand, he felt grateful for her attention, but on the other hand, he was terrified that she might learn the truth about his life. He was afraid that she would look at him with pity, or worse, turn her back on him like everyone else, for whatever she might think. That truth was too terrible and painful to share with anyone. Still, Lisa didn't back down. She started coming over to James at recess. Sometimes they sat together at the cafeteria table, and they began to build a sort of friendship. It was actually a miracle, because he didn't know how to behave around friends. He had always been too isolated from people to trust them. Every time they talked, however, he felt two forces struggling within him. On the one hand, he longed to discover this friendship, this sense of human affection that seemed so important. On the other hand, he was gripped by the fear that if Lisa found out about his life, she would leave like everyone else. "You know, James, I've always been told that a true friend is someone who will support you even when you're not perfect," she said once, looking into his eyes with a sincerity that made him feel warm. "Do you believe that?" he asked, eyes downcast with embarrassment. "Yes, I believe that," Lisa said. "I think that if someone is going through difficulties, they should be able to find support from those around them." The words echoed in his heart. James wondered, maybe Lisa was the one who could help him find the strength he'd long ago lost, but his fear continued to grip him, and he didn't know if he was ready to open up to her. James sat at the window of his room, looking out at the dark sky. The house was silent, as it always was when the Browns were busy with their chores. He was alone, and as usual, that feeling of loneliness never left him. For the past few days, he had tried to distance himself from Lisa, avoiding her nosy questions about what was going on in his life. But Lisa had been persistent. She wouldn't go away. She couldn't just leave him alone when she saw him suffering. And maybe that was what James feared the most, that one day she wouldn't just ask, but find out the truth. He knew she'd noticed his wounds, his bruises, and despite his attempts to hide them, her eyes were too perceptive. She wasn't just a girl after all. She sensed something was wrong. Lisa couldn't get past his pain. One morning, when Lisa and James were sitting together in class again, she couldn't take it anymore. She couldn't keep quiet anymore, and it was making her more and more anxious. She turned to her friend, who was sitting next to her, and looked him in the eye and said, "James, I can't watch you suffer anymore. You don't have to be alone with this. I've noticed that you're not okay, and if you need to say something, I won't judge you. We can talk it out, and if you're scared, I'll help you." James felt his chest tighten and his heart start to beat faster. He didn't know what to say. He didn't want her to know about what was going on at home, but he couldn't hide his pain any longer. He tried to find the strength to explain, but the words wouldn't come. Lisa realized that her words didn't give James any relief, and she decided not to insist. However, deep inside, she was already determined to help him, even if she didn't know exactly how. She felt that James needed help more than he was willing to admit, and so, when she got home, she decided to talk to her mom. When Lisa got home, her thoughts never left her for a moment. She couldn't hide her worries any longer, so she decided to tell her mom about what she had seen. Her mom, Julia, was a woman who was always willing to listen and help. She was kind and sensitive, and Lisa knew that her mother would not be indifferent. "Mom, I need to talk," Lisa said, sitting down at the kitchen table. "It's about James. I don't think there's anything wrong with him." Julia raised her eyebrows, sensing immediately that the conversation wasn't going to be easy. "What's wrong?" she asked, trying to pick up on the anxiety in her daughter's voice. "I noticed the bruises on his arms. He's trying to hide them, but I know they're not just from accidental falls. I think he's being tormented by his family. Mom, he's in a lot of pain. I can't just look at it and do nothing. I'm afraid he won't get help if nothing is changed." Julia listened attentively to her daughter, her face growing more and more serious as she realized that Lisa was not just making things up, but talking about a real problem. Lisa's mother, though kind, knew not to hesitate in such cases. "You did the right thing to tell me," Julia said, taking her daughter's hand. "I'll talk to social services. We can't let James continue to live like this." Lisa was grateful to her mother for her support, but there was still anxiety inside. She knew they had to act quickly, or James might find himself in a situation where no one could save him again. A few days later, social service inspectors came to the Browns' home. They came for a case that could have serious consequences for the family. Julia warned Lisa that the inspectors would ask questions and that it was important to tell the truth, despite the possible consequences. James was shocked when he found out that someone had come forward on his case. He knew that if the Browns found out that someone had contacted social services, he would have to face much worse consequences. He wasn't prepared for his life to become even more complicated. He tried to keep his cool, but he realized that hiding the truth was now impossible. When the inspectors arrived at the house, George and Marion immediately began to act as if they were the most perfect parents in the world. They smiled, pretended everything was fine, but James felt his heart clench as he watched them. "It's okay, inspectors. We are taking care of our son," George said as he received his guests at the door. "He's difficult, but we are trying to help him adjust to his new family." Marion added, "Yes, he's not perfect, but we do our best to make him a good person. We take care of him in spite of his problems." James saw them trying to make him look guilty. He knew their words were lies. He felt bitterness and despair building up in his chest. He was nothing of what they were saying. The inspectors listened politely to the Browns, but, noticing the unnatural tension in their demeanor, began to ask more specific questions. It was clear to them that something was wrong here. They asked James to speak to them separately, but his heart filled with fear. He couldn't afford to tell them the truth. Afraid of more punishment, he just kept silent. But Lisa, sitting on the sidelines, watched him with pain in her eyes. She saw how he was suffering, and she couldn't stay away. When inspectors asked James about his condition, the Browns immediately stepped in, trying to control the situation. "He's just a little late with his homework, and yes, he can be stubborn sometimes, but who isn't at that age?" George continued, still rubbing his side of the story. Lisa sat next to her mother, her eyes fixed on James. She hoped he could find the strength to tell her the truth, but every glance he gave her parents said he wasn't ready. She couldn't blame him. He was trapped in fear and pain, and all she could do was support him. However, Julia did not give up. She knew she had to move on. "I want to talk to him alone," she told the inspectors. "I believe he needs help, and if you need him to feel safe, I am ready to support him. We cannot allow this situation to continue." James realized that his life would not be the same, that the truth would finally begin to be revealed, but he didn't know how it would affect his future. James woke up that day with the feeling that the world around him had become a little different. He didn't know what exactly had changed, but he felt it intuitively. The fear that had always sat deep in his chest now felt less heightened. There was a strange, almost elusive feeling that someone important was now watching him. Someone was looking out for him, and while the fear didn't disappear, it became a little easier to carry. The first few days after the social services visit were full of nervousness. There was a strange silence in the Brown house. George and Marion, as before, did not allow James to be himself, continuing their tyrannies in strict order, but now he felt that something louder and more destructive to them might come out of that silence. He couldn't understand why this was so, but an inner voice told him that something was changing. For the first time, he didn't have to hide the pain. He didn't have to fear being robbed of his home. He felt like he wasn't alone. A few days later, the inspectors returned. This time there were more of them. Social services began to conduct follow-up inspections, including visiting the school, talking to teachers and the Browns' neighbors. James didn't know how to feel about it. He sat in the classroom listening to Lisa quietly explain to him that his life would not be the same now. They would come to the school to talk to the teachers and Lisa would help the inspectors gather information. All these questions about him seemed to him something distant, strange and yet inevitable. He wanted to believe that he would be rescued, but it was hard to shake the feeling that even if he got help, it would bring new problems. Everyone at school noticed that James had become a little different. His demeanor changed. He became more silent, but there was a kind of determination in his eyes that hadn't been so obvious before. Teachers began to ask questions as they watched him in class. He was afraid that he would be exposed, that everyone would find out about his life and the Brown family, but he realized that he could no longer remain silent. The older female teachers were wary of his condition but were afraid to interfere. However, once social services came to them, they couldn't help but notice the obvious signs of abuse. On the third day of testing, James began to notice that the teachers were no longer silent. They were asking questions. checking to see how he was doing without taking their eyes off him. Their eyes didn't have the detached, indifferent expression he'd seen before. Now they were trying to figure out what was wrong with him. Late at night, as James was walking home, he saw the people from the social department talking to his neighbors. He couldn't understand exactly what was going on, but every time he walked by he felt the attention on him intensify. At that moment, the same question was swirling around in his mind. What will happen if they find out the whole truth? He still couldn't believe that anyone could really help him. After all, he was just a boy who couldn't help himself. Too weak, too scared to go through all this. There was silence in his room again, but this silence was different, more realized. When the inspectors came back with a second inspection, they gathered all the testimony from teachers, neighbors, and soon began to build a complete picture of what had been going on in the Brown home. James gradually learned exactly what he should not have been hiding. Teachers talked about his late arrivals to school, his fatigue, and the bruises and abrasions they had seen. Neighbors also confirmed that they often heard screaming but never dared to intervene. The inspectors truly examined every detail of his life. The Browns, despite their apparent perfection, couldn't hide everything, and the more the inspectors dug in, the more the real picture began to emerge. Things were beginning to become obvious. Each day, as the social services continued their investigation, the picture became clearer. James remembered being locked in a room for 24 hours without food, being forced to do all the housework despite being completely exhausted. He remembered how he was blamed for not doing his chores, how he was humiliated, made to feel superfluous. The Browns tried to convince everyone that James was a difficult child, that he just couldn't adjust to his new life. But the more evidence of abuse they provided, the harder it was to hide the truth. Social workers began checking the Browns' financial records and other aspects of their lives, and it soon became clear that they were using their adopted son as free labor, not only with physical abuse, but also with psychological pressure. James was forced to work to exhaustion. He had no time or energy for rest or normal development. He was turned into a workhorse, all under the family comfort they were trying to create. The inspectors could not turn a blind eye to this. Even if the Browns tried to create the appearance of a perfect family, their internal relationship with James was destructive. James knew that more and more people were beginning to realize his suffering. He was horrified, but at the same time he felt that this was a chance. Maybe he could finally be rid of this nightmare. Maybe his life would change and he could no longer be afraid at night. However, the fight for justice was just beginning. The Browns were not going down without a fight. Every day they became more aggressive, their answers more convoluted and desperate. But with each new piece of evidence, the truth became more and more apparent. James didn't know how it would end, but now he believed he had a chance at freedom. James stood in the doorway of the Brown house, looking at the car parked in the driveway. This was the moment he had waited so many years for. But now, standing in front of it, he felt not so much relief as a slight shiver that ran through his entire body. He was free. But what would happen next? What would it feel like to truly be free? Saying goodbye to this house wasn't like in the movies, where children rescued from abusive parents run out into the street, smiling happily, hugging their new parents. No, James stood here alone, without any confidence that the future would be bright. There was fear and bitterness in his heart, but there was also a sense of a new path ahead that he couldn't yet understand. He was afraid that his life would remain as gray and meaningless as it was, but suddenly a spark of hope flared in his chest. The social worker's car was parked nearby, and James slowly approached it. Inside the car sat a new family, a family that was ready to take him in. Despite his fears, despite his past, they were Rob and Catherine Hunter, the couple who had been trying to adopt James for months now. They were kind, patient people who were determined to give James a chance to start a new life. When James first entered their house, he felt a stark difference. Everything was just as it had been in his dreams: cozy rooms, flowers on the windows, shelves of books, soft armchairs where you could just sit and read, and most importantly, silence. A silence that was not broken by shouts and threats. Instead of cold stares and orders, here he was met with warmth, Here no one forced him, no one humiliated him. It was a place where he could be himself, where his opinion and feelings meant something. Rob and Catherine greeted James with genuine kindness. They didn't try to establish a relationship with him right away or impose themselves on him. They were just there for him, giving him space, showing him that he was safe. James couldn't get used to it right away, but gradually he began to feel that he wasn't just someone else's child here, but a member of the family. The ease with which they treated him caused James a deep inner resistance. It was unnatural, so much kindness, so much attention. He didn't know how to deal with it. For the first week, James watched the new family, listening to their conversations, trying to understand their motivation. He couldn't believe that this kindness didn't hide a hidden agenda. He was used to the fact that a good attitude always had something worse behind it. But with each passing day, his doubts began to dissipate. He saw how Rob and Catherine cared for each other and for him, how they paid attention to his needs. There was no conflict, yelling, or punishment in their home. There was room in this house for him. In the first week, James finally started to open up. He couldn't trust his new parents completely right away, but he took small steps. For example, when Catherine asked him if he wanted to have dinner with them at the same table, James silently agreed. He was afraid of making a mistake, afraid it would be his last dinner with them, but with each bite of food his anxiety slowly faded. When Rob offered to help him fix his bike, James felt a strange warmth inside. It was a simple request, but it meant so much more to him than just an offer of help. It was the first offer of trust. Catherine, noticing his silence and wariness, did not insist, but simply left him time to get used to it. She left the door to the kitchen open so he could join her if he wanted to. At some point he began to feel more comfortable around them. It wasn't an instant transformation, but step by step, day by day, James began to open up, less and less afraid of being abandoned or betrayed. James was still struggling with the transition to a new class, but his studies were no longer a torment. Now he had room to learn and grow. He began to get help at school, not only from his teachers, but also from Lisa, who continued to support him despite everything that was going on. Lisa and her parents helped him with his homework, listened to his worries, and told him more than once that if he ever wanted to share, they would always be there for him. Rob and Catherine helped him at home. Instead of repressing him, as the Browns did, they encouraged his curiosity, letting him choose what he liked, what he wanted to learn. Rob even enrolled him in an art class because he knew how much James loved the activity. This was something new for James. His talents and desires became important. Instead of just being a kid who does chores, he became an individual whose interests are valued. The dreams that James used to hide in his soul were now his source of strength. He began to draw again, but now his pictures were not full of pain. His drawings became brighter, full of life and hope. He drew nature, houses, people, and most importantly, himself and the world. Among people who really cared about him, he dreamed of a future where he could be himself, not what the Browns tried to make him. Every night as he sat at his desk, drawing, he realized that now he had a chance at a new life. He was no longer the kid who had been ignored and used. He was James Hunter, a boy who could build his own future, not be someone else's toy. As time passed, James changed. He began to believe in himself. He was stronger than ever. He felt a love that demanded nothing in return. Rob and Catherine Hunter not only accepted him, but supported him in his personal endeavors, gave him the freedom to make choices, and showed him that every step, even the smallest, mattered. The freedom James dreamed of was not only the absence of violence, but the ability to love and be loved. He no longer felt that his life depended on other people's moods, on other people's decisions. He was the master of his own destiny. And in that moment, as James gazed out the window, contemplating what would now befall him, he realized he had only a bright future ahead of him. Time passed, and James grew more and more accustomed to his new life. His soul, which had once been compressed by pain and fear, began to open up like a flower in the spring sunshine. He was learning to live in the present, not constantly looking back, not letting past traumas rule his present. but deep in his heart remained the lessons he had learned from what he had experienced, lessons that had become his strength. His relationship with Lisa became more than just a friendship, it was a real support. She was there for him when he was having a hard time, when he couldn't find words to express his feelings. Lisa continued to be the ray of light that illuminated his path when the dark clouds of the past tried to loom over him again. In her eyes, James saw a genuine concern that demanded nothing in return but trust and time. "You know, James," she said once, as they sat on a bench in the schoolyard, "I'm proud of you. You've gotten stronger. You're stepping forward with courage." James looked at his friend and felt a warm fire blossom in his chest. He didn't know how to tell her how much her support meant to him. He just smiled, squinting his eyes, and said quietly, "You're very important to me too, Lisa. You made me realize that it's possible to believe in people." He realized that for years of loneliness and pain, for all the horrors he had endured, he could finally find not just friends, but people who were there for him and not afraid. Catherine and Rob Hunter had given him a chance, but it was Lisa who taught him how to be human, how to trust and open up. The healing process was a long one. Sometimes James would wake up in a cold sweat at night, feeling the Browns' hands on his wrists again, their cold words cutting into his soul. But now he knew there were other people, those who were not afraid and would not turn their backs on him. Every time he woke up and found kind faces around him, when Rob played sports with him or Catherine taught him how to cook, it all took away bits of the fear that still lingered in his heart. James began to learn to look to the future. He realized that his past did not define his life. There were so many possibilities in his hands. He began to develop his talents: drawing, nature study, literature. In each of these activities he found a piece of himself, his strength and love, which were now part of his new life. But the most important thing James realized was that the past, for all its pain, had become his strength. He learned to use his pain as motivation. If he survived, if he could survive at all, nothing could break him anymore. He decided that every step in his new life would be a step forward, a step towards becoming what he had always dreamed of being: a happy and confident man. His former pain became the fuel that allowed him to move on. He hadn't forgotten his experiences, but now they didn't keep him caged. He had learned to find joy in the simplest things, in the picture he was painting, in the laughter with Lisa, in the lessons Rob and Catherine were giving him. It had all become part of who he was now. One day, as he and Lisa sat on the roof of the school building, enjoying the last rays of the fall sun, James shared his dreams. "I want to be an artist. I want my paintings to tell the story of people who overcome difficulties. A story about strength, about the importance of not giving up. I want to show people that anything is possible." Lisa looked at him and said, "You can do it. I believe in you, James. You've already proven you can do anything." The words were simple, but they were important to James. He felt that this support would always be there, that he was no longer alone, and though the future was unknown, he was no longer afraid to step into it. Now that his heart was filled not with fear but with hope, he knew that something amazing was ahead of him. James noticed more and more often that the pain that once seemed insurmountable was turning into a light trail that was leading him to a better future. He felt loved and needed, which was the most important thing to him. He knew that his family, Rob and Catherine, Lisa and her parents, would support him in any endeavor, and that feeling gave him the strength to move forward. He did not know what lay ahead, but now he was not afraid. He realized that he could make a choice, that his life was now in his hands. He decided to go after his dreams, to paint, to teach people that despite the darkness of the past, light can always break through. He knew he was worthy of the best. With each new day, his life was filled with meaning. He taught himself to be happy in spite of everything that had gone before. He realized that real happiness is not in forgetting the past, but in accepting it and moving forward despite everything. James sat in his room, looking at his drawings, which now reflected not only nature and people, but also himself, that boy who had managed to survive, overcome all obstacles and find his place in the world. He knew there were many more trials ahead of him, but now he was ready to face them with confidence. The pain of the past no longer had power over him. He was strong, ready to go through life with his head held high, with faith in the future and with the love that had been given to him. There was light in his life again. Thank you for your attention and for letting this story be a part of your day. Take care of yourself and your loved ones. See you again.